Good evening, everybody. My name is Michael Myers, and I was Carl's next-door neighbor at work. And very interesting relationship. I've only been in downstate since 2008. But there's a couple of things I want to say about they characterize our relationship. Carl would walk by, and we'd start talking, and I'd always invite him in to sit down. I don't think he ever sat in my office. I mean, that was quite a few years. I'd say, Carl, come in and sit down. But he was never clear about, I'm rushing off, I can't do this. But yet, the talk would keep going. And then sometimes it would get kind of intimate because we're both of a certain age. And so we talked about aging, but not from a professional standpoint, as even though he's a geriatric psychiatrist. It's about our own personal failings. And especially as Carl was having trouble with his running, and we talked about being an athlete earlier and things like that, that weren't working as well for him as they used to. But I have very fond memories of that. The other memory I have is looking from the hallway into his office, because he always had somebody in training at his office sitting there. He was at the computer, and I witnessed so much of his mentoring going on over the years. What I want to share with you, and this is a tribute from one of our graduates from downstate, Dr. Nurum Begum, who, when she learned of Carl's death, sent this a text to me. I told her that I would read it tonight. I am deeply saddened by the news of Dr. Cohen's passing. I have such good memories of him. For our research projects and write-ups, we used to visit the apartment on weekends. Recently, when let me just get my glasses here. Recently, when I contacted him to ask for a letter of recommendation for my UPenn job, she's a psychiatrist at UPenn, I was so hesitant to ask because I thought he might not remember me after so many years. He replied right away and even sent me a research paper titled that we had co-authored. I forgot to include that in my resume. He asked me to add that to my CV and wrote the letter of reference right away. He was such a great mentor and educator. May he rest in peace in eternity. Best way to process loss is by sharing our feelings, emotions, and memories. Just wanted to share my thoughts with you about Dr. Cohen. Thank you.
I want to thank the speakers who went before. I am so moved, and so you filled in so much that I didn't know about Carl. I go back with him 45 years. Don't see him as frequently as you all do. So what I have is, so anyway, you've just given me a gift of all that information. We were introduced by Marty Hoffman, who is somewhere here, over there, I think. Hi, Marty. And he is a mutual friend. He knew we lived in the same neighborhood, Carl and I, this neighborhood at the time, thought we would like each other, and indeed we did, and have stayed in contact for all these years. Most of my memories of Carl involve eating. That is, having meals together, either in restaurants or at his and Katie's apartment. With dinner, it was typically dinner, always came lively and engaging conversation. Carl had, as you know, opinions about everything, which is something I loved about him. One thing I did not like about him is his aversion to the suburbs where I moved. At least my suburb in Westchester. I invited him numerous times to come visit, and he usually declined and asked if instead we could meet in the city. I do give him credit for coming to our home in Larchmont at least once. That was because I can remember Sarah raking the leaves in our backyard, and I can remember Zach and my son Jeremy running around the Rye Playland. And in fact, these activities may even have happened over 2 separate times. Kudos to you, Carl. Carl was always Carl. As I think just came out, you just confirmed everything that I've felt about him these years when I reflect on him. He never put on airs, did or said things just to impress someone else, other than periodically mentioning some research he was involved with or a collaborator whom he had worked with. Jay, we were talking about that before. He just never, he didn't talk about work much. So you filled in a lot for me. He never bragged or even offhandedly mentioned his many accomplishments, most of which I was completely unaware of until a few years ago. I hadn't spoken to him for a while, and for whatever reason, didn't have, probably my disorganization, didn't have his contact information handy. I decided the most efficient way to get in touch was through Downstate, where I knew he was a professor. So I Googled him, and I found out that not only was he a professor, but a distinguished service professor and director of the Division of Geriatric Psychiatry and all the other titles, and did all the other things that were just previously mentioned, the many publications, and to me, the most amazing thing was being in Who's Who in the World, a directory I never even knew existed. But my friend Carl was in it. Kudos, Carl. What a guy. Carl is a model for us all, as is obvious, on how to live life with humility, integrity, and purpose. For that, among many reasons, I will miss him so much. Thank you.
I guess it's almost evening, so good afternoon, good evening to everybody. I guess I wanted to start off by saying, and we've heard this before, the shock of this. I really thought it was going to go on forever. And Carl, this is the meeting of the American Psychiatric Association, annual meeting. We have it every year, usually in May. And for those of you who don't know, Carl was a flaming radical, and a Marxist, and somebody who really believed in the possibility of liberatory practice in psychiatry, and somebody who really believed that it was critical that those of us in the profession think of ourselves as being in this profession for the people and to be of the people. Thank you. And I just want to give you a sense of what that meant. A small piece for me personally is that I heard a number of people have written articles with Carl, and that he got them involved in furthering their career. I have to say that Carl actually helped me dismantle my career. He and you know, time is so funny. It's so hard to keep a fix on this. There's a picture in that it's going through the slides over there, which I encourage everybody to look at, particularly because one of the things you'll see is the twinkle that Carl had in his eyes. And it was something that I always remember about Carl's eyes. They really did twinkle. And they're in those pictures up there. And in one of those pictures, I think there's a picture of me holding him up in a chair during a wedding. Is that possible, Kate? Anyhow, Carl lifted me up, and I hoped I helped lift him up. The way he derailed my career was that we wrote a paper called, this was been in the early, maybe mid-'80s, called Homeless Mentally Ill or Mentally Ill Homeless. And our point was, and Carl was the one who really led us to this, was that we were going through extraordinary social changes in the United States. As people who were in New York at that time remember, we had a crisis of homelessness, as we do now. And what we wanted to try to get across was that the reason that people were homeless wasn't because everybody was psychiatrically ill and that they were driven off into the streets because of their psychiatric challenges, but because our society had decided that people were expendable, and they didn't need to have a home, and they didn't need to have a job. They could just be out there. And if they became mentally ill, or if they were mentally ill and those things happened to them, that was not because they were psychiatrically challenged, it was because our society was producing them. That, of course, got me blackballed, because from the group for the Advancement of Psychiatry work group on homelessness, which insisted that the reason that everybody was homeless was because they were mentally ill and they had been driven out of the state hospitals. So Carl did get me in a little trouble, but he also gave me the opportunity to say stuff that I really needed to say and to talk about stuff that really mattered to me. I want to say a particular frame of that is the Radical Caucus. The Radical Caucus was a yearly event that happened because of Carl. And he would make sure that all of us, including going around all of the venues of the APA's meeting and dropping, hand-printed signs about come to the Radical Caucus at 7 o'clock at wherever, sort of original sort of 1960s, 70s action. And we would have people come, and there's some people here who've gone to those meetings over the years, and they were always a little weird and a little offbeat because they were so completely different from what we were getting exposed to in the rest of psychiatry. And he would make it feel like there was an actual home for us together as a group. And it was an extraordinarily powerful process, and it went on for so many years. And Carl called me in March, and he said, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get to the APA, but I've been talking to Tamar, and we may have something going on. And then he got sick, and that didn't allow it to happen. But what's going to happen is because of Carl's desire to see a better world, because that ignited something in all of us, we're not going to stop. Tomorrow I've been talking, we're going to figure out, we're going to meet in California next year. All of you, I don't care if you're in the APA, if you are a psychiatrist or not, you should come to our Radical Caucus meeting in LA next May, okay? Just come, because it's going to be fabulous. And we're going to remember Carl in that process, and we're going to also dream with Carl of the better world that he carried with him in his heart in geriatrics, in his work riding in a bicycle from shelter to SRO, in the Bowery, to wherever the hell he is right now, ministering to whoever the hell he is ministering to, and caring for and helping us, I hope, do the work that we need to continue to do. So I want to just raise a toast to Carl and just say, L'chaim. Cheers, Carl. Thank you so much for all you did for us. And for me. Who's next?
It's both wonderful and somewhat traumatizing to be here. I'm going to talk about Carl and I, and it relates to both the wonderful discussion of collaborative work. By the way, I'm a cultural anthropologist. Many people here know Carl as a psychiatrist, but he also had a sociology degree, a master's degree, which we talked about a lot as he was going through it, and that gave us an extra close connection to our work. I also had the privilege of knowing him apparently since age 2. Our parents told us that we used to play together, and apparently for a short while my mom was hired to watch him when she went back to work. I have very little memory of 2, 3, 4. I do remember both of us being transported to Manhattan. We were on the set of the Rudy Kazudi show when we were 5 years old. And I have a memory of a clown throwing confetti at us and us ducking, and that's about it. It's hard to even think about Carl not being here, He was at our house and staying over with us, and we had a wonderful dinner with Zach and his family at the favorite restaurant that he's been to before, my wife and myself. And many people talked about Carl's connection to food. And I'll mention that in a moment, how it determined who was going to write the first draft of the many papers that we wrote together, including a book. Anyway, despite not Carl being here, I know with this outpouring of love and concern and championing of Carl's interest, that's certainly the essence of what made him Carl, is still all around us. Eventually, we were born 3 weeks apart. And even though I don't remember much about 3, 4, 5, very distinct to my mind are our young years together and developing connection to a group of friends, Norman and Gary, and Jimmy, who's not here, was not feeling well, joined us at age 12. And we were a group that did everything together, especially in the summer, every day to the beach. And the funny thing I remember about Carl, when he and I both at the same time got leftover clubs from older relatives, mine 1940s from a great uncle, and we decided we should play golf. The only problem is, in the 1950s, there was only one course in Brooklyn, Danker Beach, and actually in the 60s was in the Guinness Book of World Records as the most played on golf course in the world. And so I would knock on his door, actually the window by his bedroom, at about 3:30 a.m. Bus 1, bus 2, bus 3, we'd get there a little after 4:30, we'd sign up for playing 4 hours later. We did this for 2 years, and I gave it up for tennis. But there were many years with our 4 friends and me and Carl playing handball, and I graciously let him beat me about 15 years ago, even though I hadn't played handball in about 40 years at that point. He was sweating at 15-15. I say this for his handball friends, who I think are going to be talking as the last group. And in terms of the last speaker who mentioned Carl getting me into some trouble, he got me into joyous trouble in the 1970s when I was living in Manhattan, grasping to find a full-time career as an anthropologist and an academic. And he first got me involved with the first study we did on released mental patients that you alluded to before. And then he got me working on this huge project on older homeless on the Bowery, and got me into some wonderful good trouble, especially while living with the homeless guys on Madison Square Park, which is not too far from where we're standing. The final major project we did, which I didn't want to do whatsoever, was he said, well, we've done all this project on mental illness, on homelessness. There's these elderly living in the same SRO hotels. So let's just talk about 1974, 75, before they started destroying these hotels. Let's study the homeless. There's very few people doing that. And reluctantly, we did that. And to my great regret at the time, but my great joy now, it really created a career for me, because I could not get an academic job studying Mexican peasants at that time, because everyone and his uncle was also doing that in the 1970s. So I have a great debt for this good trouble Carl got me into in studying the elderly in the United States, and eventually it became my career of an anthropologist of late life around the globe. In all this, we were actively writing and doing research together. And I mentioned food before. We had this tradition. Every time we were sort of starting out with an idea for an article, whether it was on mental health, whether it was on homelessness, whether it was on late life. We go back and forth a few paragraphs here and there, and then I'd be coming into New York for some project we were working on, and we had this tradition. It would be 10:30, 11 o'clock. We were both bouncing off ideas about where we're going to go with the article. And the first person who said, "Oh, where are we going to go for lunch?" I knew the other person was going to write the first draft. And it was pretty even over the 10 or so articles, and we even wrote a book together, Old Men in the Bowery. And if you're a New Yorker, you can walk down to the Strand, and they'll probably beg you to take a copy off the shelf if you can still find it. In all, he was the constant friend, collaborator of over 70 years. And like many of you, challenged me in my ideas in anthropology and psychiatry. He will always be a part of my heart, a dear friend and collaborator. In closing, 2 days ago, I received an email from an anthropologist in France who had got her degree at Columbia and had a hard time, and worked with both me and Carl. She was studying homeless populations there. And she wanted me to read this to the crowd. Carl was unique, and I think many of us believe that in our hearts. Smart, generous, clear-headed, cogent, committed to 30 areas of psychiatric care and to social justice. In and out of work, Carl radiated warmth and a needed humorous take, but never at the expense of seriousness and sincerity. We last emailed in March. Across the ocean in France, too. He is missed. Thank you.
Said, I know Carl and you were close. I'm sorry. You need to know that his work on the streets made a difference. We know this, but it matters to hear it from the head of the NIH division that deals with this. For our next speaker, I'd like to invite Christina Byrne to talk about Carl's work at St. Francis Friends of the Poor.
I'm with St. Francis Friends of the Poor. I did not have the pleasure of knowing Carl personally, but Carl's legacy with the work of St. Francis Friends of the Poor is something that I felt needed to be talked about here because it fits in with what everyone else was saying. So his radicalism that some of you spoke about getting him into trouble actually helped to form the permanent supportive housing movement for people with mental illness and who experienced homelessness in the late 70s. So he met with a group of radical priests that worked in the community. He founded or was part of founding community psychiatry and went into these old SRO hotels to help people who had been discharged from the state institutions to live lives with dignity. And he, along with the fathers, decided to help found St. Francis Friends of the Poor, which provides permanent supportive housing to adults living with mental illness, and he has served on that board for over 40 years, helping to shape who we are today and changing the lives of so many individuals prior to us, but this movement now carries on forever, and so his legacy will literally go on forever. So just on behalf of St. Francis Friends of the Poor, we want to thank Carl and his family.
John Cuby. I come from a very different perspective on Carl. I actually didn't know Carl all that well, but I knew him for a very long period of time. And his wife Katie, I discovered earlier, remembers me from when I taught her neuroanatomy. It won't take a year. A long time ago. Anyway, so let me give a little bit of an institutional perspective. So I worked at Downstate for many, many years, as has Carl. And as many of you know, institutions get you very mixed feelings. Downstate gives us very, well, mixed feelings, let's say that. But whenever I saw Carl, it was a positive feeling. This was a sense of someone in my community, in my institution, who I really like. I feel is really doing something and feels me good, makes me feel good about the institution I'm working in. We had positive connections. There was this, I hate to say, sort of magnetism. We would sit down, talk to each other, tell jokes, that kind of thing for a brief period of time. We had what was called the brown bag meeting, where we tried to make intellectual contact with radical psychiatrists and neuroscience, and trying to figure what the brain mechanisms might be, or the psychological mechanism of doing all this stuff together. But the important point I want to make is that Carl was an institutional glue, and we all feel very, very mixed feelings about institutions. But Carl was part of what made Downstate, and my feeling towards Downstate, very positive.
Had no idea about Carl's background and his accomplishments until the last year or two of our. We only knew each other on the handball courts, which we've been playing for. I knew Carl since he was 21, and the only time in my life I ever beat him on the handball court because he was just learning. But I also knew him a little bit because I'm a blood specialist, and he turned out to have a condition that was obviously in my realm. Can you hear me? Oh, I'm sorry. I happen to also have been a blood specialist, and I knew a little bit about Carl's condition as the years had passed when he had that. And we were very close, and we spoke a lot together. But we all knew, this group of us knew Carl in a totally different way. Because on the handball court, he was not a professor. He was just a player, and he played like mad. He didn't like to lose. That is for certainly sure. But he was a great friend to all of us, and we really loved him a lot. That's why the remaining handball group is here, because unfortunately our group has thinned out over the years as we've all become geriatric. And I'm probably close to the most geriatric in the group, although there are several people here today who actually in the handball group even more geriatric than I am. But we love this guy like you can't believe. Is that Zach? Is that, where's Zach? Okay. Our little boys used to watch us on the handball court, but my son never wanted to play. And I used to say to my son how I failed him because he's a Met fan, he's a Jet fan, and he became an attorney. But he was never on the handball court. I don't know if Zach ever was on the handball court either. But we had so much fun. I can't tell you, we played at least twice a week, and we played for hours. He loved the game, and he was playing down in Florida till the very end. He played, I think, a game with his friend Jimmy, we used to call Jimmy the Pest. And he played his last game right before he came back to New York. So he never gave it up, and we all, unfortunately, some of us has had to give it up, but we love the game and we love Carl.
Does anyone here know what his nickname was in the gym? Everybody had a nickname. His was named after Groucho Marx character Hackenbush because of his haircut. He was the guy that I never thought would precede us out of this world, because if anybody took good care of himself, it was him. But Ira, knowing his position and what was wrong with him, he wasn't surprised. We all were. And each week I would try and give him a joke, being a salesman. So when I got to Florida, he said, "All right, what was the joke of last week? Who remembered what you ate for breakfast the last morning?" But in any case, I had told him the last joke that I told him was of Sam and Irving who were drinking buddies. And one day, Irving says, "Sam, we've been drinking for 40 years, and the doctor told me I'm going out of this world in 4 months. And I want you to know that it's been great." So Irving says, Sam says, "Well, give me a signal, something from above, because I know you're going to heaven. And when you get there, I'd like to know how heaven is, because you help everybody in this world, just like Carl would. He's okay, so for 6 months, he's walking around without Irving. And one night the phone rings, and Sam says, hello. He says, it's Irving, you're calling me from the hereafter. How are you? He said, all right. He said, tell me, how is it in the hereafter? He says, all right, what are you doing here all day? I get up in the morning, have some lettuce, and have some sex. For lunch, have some more lettuce and have some more sex. So he said, my God, sounds like heaven's a great place. He said, heaven? Who's in heaven? I'm a rabbit in Oklahoma. So Carl, that's the one, that's the last one you got. He was a hell of a player. I never thought he'd been afraid one to go. The way he took care of himself, he ate and took care of it. He came to the gym with a bicycle, never used a car, except for when he worked in Brooklyn. Other than that, everybody before me said enough great stuff about a great guy. And he'll be missed because our crowd is thinning out, and one by one, let's hope that we meet in the better circumstances. Everybody, all the best to you all.
Thank you. So, I think to wrap up this portion of the evening, for those that have a glass nearby, I ask that we raise one. If you don't, raise your spirits. To Carl, the most interesting man in the world, friend, geropsychiatrist, mentor, handball player, radical, advocate, liberal, parent, spouse, and I have to end on this note given where we started, grandparent. Here, here.